Chapter 3. But before they reached La Florida, Soto and his army landed in Cuba. There were several reasons for this, legal and otherwise. But for Soto, staying in Cuba allowed him to prepare. In that short time, his army doubled. Out of the thousands of servants and slaves in Cuba, Soto brought the most trustworthy and those who could interpret the most languages. He made his wife governess of Havana, and in haste, Soto hired an expensive lawyer and drew up his official will and testimony. Cuba itself provided quite an ample amount of necessities, included food and livestock. And again, everything and every number were recorded by the scribes. 2 scribes in particular were assigned to write daily entries of the entire entrada. The first man was named Rangel. He served as Soto's main secretary and personal valet. The second man was the gentleman of Alvas. He was a treasurer and a scribe who invested much into the entrada and chronicled the journey on his own accord. And although the 2 men hardly knew each other, the journals acted not just as documents, but as living evidence of all that would occur in La Florida. What they saw, they wrote down, and Soto was quite aware. Indeed, he was glad, because history was recorded, and the whole world would know. As the weeks passed, Soto cleared prior engagements and ordered the ships of the entrada to immediately report to dock. Even more men wanted to join and lined up to be registered, but Soto did not wait. And on Sunday, the 18th of May, 1539, Governor Hernando de Soto left the town of Havana with a noble armada of 9 ships. And on the 25th of the same month, land was sighted. La Florida, the land of flowers. They saw it by the moonlight. The ships set anchor, and the Spanish waited until dawn. A thick fog made the air dense and moist. Then the order was given, and the first platoon climbed out of their boats and onto the land. Their faces lit up in the dark by their torches. They rummaged through. Their boots slammed the surf. The land stretched on with swamps and trees. They followed tiny streams that led east. They heard the snaps of branches and the endless hums of the insects above. And the further they went, the more they heard a whirling sound. The sound of wind. They trailed off the sandbanks, muddied ravines and creeks, and they eventually found a widening river. Then the sun emerged. A bright, bulging, unforgiving blindness cast upon the entire land, and the Spanish sweated in their armor. And the monks and the priests blessed and kissed the sands. At noon, the captains gathered and peered beyond. Some stared at their maps, while others just stared and waited for Soto. They watched him appear as he staggered to the sands in a slow and methodical fashion. But Soto seemed amused. He seemed to take pleasure in the horror. He mimicked the birds and whistled through his teeth. He turned to his captains and gave them a cordial nod. Then he broke rank, staggered on, and went about alone. Soto crossed knee-deep into water and turned to see the stream bend to a perch. Beside the brambles, he followed the sunlight. Then he stopped. Below the brambles were petals of wildflowers that floated downstream. A strong wind swept more petals to the ground, and Soto watched the petals dance and saunter down to the water. They were of lavender and lilies, and they raced downstream in a swirling stew of magnified and bursting color. There were petals of white and crimson, of bright yellow, sapphire, and rich, deep blue orchids, and they rested upon each other and became a collective bed of flowers, an orchestra of beauty. Soto marveled at the sight, but only momentarily. He drew a heavy sigh and stood tall. His captain stood beside him. They waited several minutes, but Soto remained in his own gaze. "Don Hernando?" said Moscoso. "Yes." "What shall we do with the natives?" "We will treat them kindly, as we always have. But if they do not act in accordance, we'll take them in as slaves. They will be vital. We need as many translators as we can get." Naves. What a fool. Then Soto barged forth through the swamp alone. For the entire day, Hector and Vicente unloaded heavy items from the ship and onto the sands. Their captain, Canales, a tall older man with scars on his face, stayed on the ship and observed them. He watched his men carry quilts and canvas. Then he watched them unload the caravans. Later, he watched them unload all the inventory of the blacksmiths, which included anvils, hammers, torches, and specialized flints. And later, he watched the men unload all of their excess armor, plate, shields, and helmets. Towards noon, 2 other ships had landed. These ships carried nothing but horses. Later came the oxen and steer. Huddles of goats and sheep followed, as did the immensity of flies. And the whole of the air stank and settled. Then came the artillery ships. The light cannons were first, followed by the medium cannons. Teams of lower-ranked men hauled the strips of wood and laid the weight across their shoulders as they climbed the sandhills. The last cannons were carried by teams of oxen and steers. In total, it took 4 hours to unload them all, and as the mules pressed on the hill of sands, the thousands of pounds of steel followed across. Finally, the last ship made it to shore. The men called it the pig ship, because frankly, it was. There were 500 pigs in all. Most of them were pink and gray, and some were as big as miniature horses, weighing 600 pounds apiece. Their eyes were black and dense, as if space itself. Hector and Vicente looked on and sneered as the beasts pounded their way forth. Their faces were smeared with dirt and snot, and what followed were a cacophony of flops, squeals, scalding screams, and a low rumbling of snorting. All of the hogs were from Trujillo and from good stock, and the majority of them came from Soto's investments he made in Cuba. It took 20 men to escort the pigs to shore, and it took another 20 more to set them up the hill. Overjoyed, the hogs took to their new lands, and like their captors, they relished and squealed and went and forged their way onward. When all the ships were unloaded, Soto ordered all the platoons to march a mile forward. They searched the dead trees of the marsh and came across dense swamps and tall grass. Soto then gave the captains leave, and as dark descended, the men from each platoon made their own fires. The air remained stagnant and void. Not a wind nor a breeze blew, and at sunset, the first 5 pigs were roasted underneath giant banana leaves. The heat had stayed through the dark. The flies and mosquitoes danced and hummed, and as Hector and Vicente talked themselves to sleep, their platoon leader, Canales, came to their side. He looked at them with general disdain, but something about them made him smile. Then he closed his eyes and rested, but the rest of the Spanish kept their eyes open. They stared up at the stars. Their eyes were both young and old. They were bright and big and filled with uncertainty. The eyes of Vicente and Hector, the eyes of Moscoso, of Balthazar, of Juan de Anasco, and Cristal de Espandola. And for that night, and many nights to follow, their eyes of their General Hernando de Soto remained quiet, confident, and alone. 3 days passed. The army marched north and slashed their way through thick vines and shrubs, 3 times taller than the tallest man in the unit. And eventually, when they had cleared a path, the men's faces lit up red with blisters. Juan de Anasco led the horses down a narrow path, and around noontime, a new sight was revealed. 6 miles down, 10 men reported seeing 12 stand-in huts. Each platoon yelled back to each other as word spread, and soon 100 men converged over to the huts. There were 12 tall straw huts, but each and every hut was empty. They found wooden bowls and spoons. They found spider webs and headdresses. Some men found spears and shavens, and still others found bones of fish and a trail of sticks and necklaces. Towards the edge of the huts, they found a fire pit that consisted of a circle of stones and black oily tar. Below, they found splits of gray thin wood, and in one of the huts, they found full plates of abandoned fish bones that weren't even a day old. The translators were ushered forward. They all confirmed that the village and terrain of La Florida was named Osita. And soon after, the captains gathered and waited on their horses. For a quarter of an hour, Soto inspected each hut and retrieved tiny stones, which he placed in his hand and studied. When he had finished, he returned to the pit. He drew his sword and held it for a minute. Then he sifted it back into his cloak. But there wasn't a look of joy on his face, and the captains continued to wait for their orders. "They were just here," said Soto. "They probably saw our ships." Moscoso finally came to his side. "Don Hernando." "Someone must have warned them," said Soto. "Have you found a trail?" "No, not yet," said Moscoso. "Then what are you waiting for?" The sun had died. Moscoso saluted, performed his orders, and moved the cavalry a mile west. And as the wind turned, a whale of rain pounded and poured onto Soto's army. But Soto kept his head up and pressed forward. His eyes studied the treetops high above, and the rain continued to pour. The next days passed. The land of La Florida went on. It was a constant hell of swamps and streams. And so the 500 Spaniards marched into its interior, fueled by dreams of gold. They were divided into platoons. Half went west to follow the coast. The other half went north and followed the streams. The cavalry slashed their way through the dense jungle. The infantry followed the hills of sand. But, inevitably, the sands dissipated to the marsh, and the swamps returned. Towards noon, the cavalry found the stream's delta. The delta looked clear like crystal. Beneath the canopy, the orchids again floated on the streams in swirls with hues of orange and crimson and green. The water was clear, and the stones and brooks scattered from east to west. Soto brought his horse to the water. He followed the streams on foot. He looked up and examined the tall trees before him. There were elms and oaks against giant sycamores. but Soto looked specifically at the low-level birches and sturdy pines. Then, Moscoso rode up to him. Sir, said Moscoso. What are your coordinates? Said Soto. North by northwest, Don Hernando. Exactly Navaez's route. Good, said Soto. La Florida is certainly the hell on earth I expected. Good. He looked again to the trees. These trees are very tall, he said. Yes, Don Hernando, they are, said Moscoso. We shall use them then, said Soto. Cut them down and assemble rafts. We'll need them soon. Send 2 scouts 2 miles inland. Send a chopping unit. Send a hunting unit. Don't be afraid to make as much noise as you can. The order was given and the men went to work. They took to their axes and hacked and chopped. And as the rain strengthened, the men sliced and hacked until they gathered enough wood. The other men assembled the timber, tied the twine together, and hammered out nails. And as the heat lingered, their faces turned red as pomegranates. The rain strengthened. The fires died. Another endless fog took over. But the men continued to work. Their shiny armor had already started to rust. Their constant work continued through the day and well into the night. During the morning of the next day, 6 rafts were assembled, and at noon there were 9. When the rafts were ready, the Spanish climbed on board. The men switched their heads to and fro. They looked at the treetops and gave into the dizzying hum of the insects. The rafts caught a current and raced carefully down the backstretch, but then the waters became still. While they rode, they saw bright, small yellow birds, and beyond they saw a pink and gray swirling skyline. They steered 3 miles, and within an hour, they landed on the banks. The new land was a dizzying stretch of marsh and sand. The captains gave their order, and the men trekked north. And as they did, a flock of blackbirds flooded the sky. The men poured forward, and the cavalry emerged alongside them. Then, it rained again. It rained for 3 straight days. The first day was mist and drizzle, and for the next 2 days, the rain poured into globs of steady, sideways streams, and streaks of mud smacked onto every Spaniard's face. At night, Hector and Vicente slept through the heat and drizzle. Very often, they heard a wind. It was an echoing, drowning voice. Perhaps it was of a horror not so long ago, and the 2 young men spoke sparsely to each other. It feels like God is pissing on us, said Vicente. He must be, said Hector. He must have drunk the whole ocean. On the 4th day, the rain finally stopped. The army marched north through the swamp and cleared a path. All day long, the Spanish slashed away at the tall grass and dense canopies, and their boots sunk and submerged in unleveled mud. Later, they came upon islands of dead trees. Their boots swished and pummeled through the land. Their faces turned red, and their heavy armor became heated coffins. And although the heat had caused the men to vomit, they persisted and moved forward. And for days at a time, the rhythm repeated. The sounds of the swamps consisted of the howls of the giant blackbirds and the humming of swarming bees. Yet, deeper through the trees were the harmonies of stranger animals, snakes and bats, bears and crocodiles. As a week passed, the captains had already noticed that their men were fatigued. What progress had been made was a mystery, and as the men came forth through the dusk, Soto examined them. He looked at his men and their puzzling, horrified, but determined faces. Yet, through the night, Soto seemed to be in constant study. He stayed awake in his tent, and by candlelight, he studied all the terrain from all the maps he had gathered. But day after day, Soto seemed content with the world and his place in it. Then Moscoso approached and interrupted him again. "Why are you smiling, Don Hernando?" "I feel at home." "Feel at home?" "It's close to it, anyway." "Sir, the men saw natives in the trees, but they seem to escape. Should we go after them?" "No. Let them come to us. And when they do, chain them. They're scared. Fear will overtake them. We'll use it to our favor. Break them now. Let them know who their masters are. And never let them forget it." And as days went by, it was more of the same. They found no gold, and eerily, they found no native of any kind. In the water, the Spanish caught fish with their hands, but there were other beasts in the water. The natives called these beasts caimans, and they were enormous. One afternoon, Hector saw and studied several caimans shifting about the water. He watched one emerge above the water, and Hector stuttered and stood frozen with fear. It was the most hideous thing he had ever seen, but he could not take his eyes off it. He studied its movements and watched it waddle along the bank. Its scales were gray and hard and ribbed from top to bottom. It slid from side to side. It hissed and snarled, and its teeth glistened. And Hector just stared petrified, with his sword in his hand. He walked along the bank and slowed his stride, but his gaze remained unaltered. The caiman opened its mouth and hissed, then it dipped into the water and disappeared, leaving ripples in the mud. A minute passed. Canales approached Hector and slapped him on the back. "Ha ha ha! Beautiful beasts, aren't they?" said Canales. "Careful, though. Don't stare too long. They'll suck you whole." As night came, the man rested. Hector, Vicente, and a slew of other men gathered near a fire. Among the men were Diego Valdez, a mean son of a bitch from Seville, Pedro Amaro, a blacksmith from Toledo, and Juan Garcia Neruda, a mysterious Portuguese man who played guitar. They played cards and drank wine and cursed at the mosquitoes that swirled above their heads. All told their tales of how poor they were and how rich they would eventually become after the entrada. And as nights passed, the rest of the men ate, farted, drank, and slept. And each night, Hector and Vicente stared at the stars and contributed to all the voices of the dark. All the gold in the world. I feel it. I know it's here, Hector. What will you do with your fortune, Vicente? I don't know. You haven't thought about it? Sure, I've thought about it. But I just don't know. I've been poor all my life. I wouldn't know the first thing to do. Canales emerged from the darkness. He staggered to the fire and sat next to them. You two should sleep, said Canales. We have plenty of work to do in the morning. I can't, Captain, said Vicente. I don't see how any man can. Canales smiled. Then he looked up to the quarter moon and sighed. When you've been in this world as long as I have, sleep becomes the most important asset a man can have. I apologize, Senor Canales. I just have too many questions, said Vicente. You're young. You're supposed to ask questions. I was like you once. Don Hernando was too. That was a long time ago. I have the utmost faith in Don Hernando, said Hector. We all do, said Canales. That's why we're here, is it not? Just remember, though, Don Hernando is only a man. I knew him in Peru. I knew him when he was humble. He's a different man now. Tell me about Peru, said Vicente. I want to know everything. I'll tell you in time, but not tonight. Vicente held another question in his mind, but he waited a minute to say it. And when enough seconds had passed, the words came out, fast and direct. What do you think we'll find? Said Vicente. Canales took a cup of wine and drank it whole, and as he stared to the North Star, he spoke in wistful baritones, and his eyes fell deep into a trance. All the gold we ever found was in a city of some kind, and I expect the same case here. The Indians are not stupid. They hide their gold. Sometimes they hide it very well. I do warn all of you, these nights will be the death of you. You'll be men after this, if you survive this. And afterward, you'll be old men, just like me. And you won't know what the hell to do with yourself. Enjoy these nights, boys. Take them for what they're worth. Rejoice in your youth. You'll never get it back. And when he finished, Canales got back to his feet and stood alone beside the fire. Hector and Vicente finally slept. Their dreams were filled with fear and wonder, and their thoughts crept in with constant motion, like the pounding waves of an impending storm. 10 days had passed since the Spanish made landfall. The army made it about 20 miles inland. Yet, other than the remaining slaves of the empty town of Osita, the army found no natives of any kind. The scouts went north and east. They returned hours later and reported no sign of either Indians or gold. Finally, at the dawn of the next day, a dozen natives were sighted. They were a family of 6, 2 young men and 4 women. As the translations went on, it started to rain. The first set of slaves had no idea what the family was saying. The priest or scribes didn't understand either. And it wasn't until the slaves in Cuba were ushered in that some understanding had been made. Soto spent the entire day with the slaves and translators. He never raised his voice. Instead, he gleamed, sharpened his sword, and waited for the priest and the translators to surmise the babble into understandable Spanish. After the relay was over, the facts were laid out. The native family were slaves of the Timucua. Yet, the most important fact that the family said was that they had expected Soto's arrival. The eldest man spoke. He beat his chest and looked at Soto with reverence and candor. And the rain fell harder. He spoke in haste and went on, reciting a long and impassioned speech. It was translated to the other slaves, and the priest said one sentence. He calls you the child of the sun, said the priest. What did he say? Asked Soto. He says you are a child of the sun. And with that, Soto finally smiled. He repeated the phrase, over and over. A child of the sun. The son of the sun. In the nearby stream, the leaves floated across and danced down by the rocks. Then Soto took out a hammer, looked to the sky, and searched for the right words. A friar approached him with weary, somber eyes. They fear you, Don Hernando. Good, said Soto. What should I tell them? Tell them that this child of the sun is a gracious one, and that he must be loved every single day. In governance, I am gracious. And tell them that these men who ride horses and wear steel are the child of the sun's destined warriors. And tell them that they come in peace. The priest went on. Soto retorted once more. Also, tell them that this child of the sun has demands that must be attended to, that they will learn their real God in time, and that he will liberate you from all evil. Then Soto said his last commands. His smile faded, and he looked at all of them again with great disdain. Tell them that their enemies are enemies of the child of the sun himself, that their gods will soon die, and that this child of the sun will burn their souls if they should ever displease him. We will take their women, we'll take their lands, and they will forever know their true and righteous gods, and they shall pay for their sins. They hide in the trees. They tire as their hearts pound. They pray. They are the Timucua. Their faces are filled with angst and fear. They hold on to their spears and watch below. One native remains silent. He stares at the clouded sky. Rain begins to splatter. A bolt of lightning follows. A giant blackbird flies above. The Timucuans are frightened at the sign. They follow it and continue to stare. And as the moon climbs up, their lips tremble. The white and the fear return in the flash. For below, the demons march. They rummage through the trees with swords in their hands. They swing blindly. They are the deranged spirits of the dam. Rain and blood splatter on their faces. They want more. They bolt through. You saw them before. What is it? What are they? You remember? It can't be. I thought they... No, it is them. These are the same devils. They've returned. As the Timucua stare, all the memories return. They see a league of demons a mile wide with streaks of cannon fire. A one-eyed man leads them. Blood in pools. Blood in the sand. Blood all over. And now and present, the demons ceaselessly hover over the land. And as they ride their great beast onward, they tear through the rain and yell and scream. It's them. We strike now. No, we can't. We must. The Spanish marched on. They searched through streams and large rivers. Up ahead, they found abandoned canoes and paddles, and further down, they found more huts. The Timucua hid in the trees. They watched and waited high up top their canopies. And when they were ready, the signal was given, and the natives attacked. They jumped out from the trees and ambushed the Spanish, shooting arrows and spears. But it was short-lived. The Spanish fired back with their cannons, striking the trees and catching them on fire. The smoke lifted, and the natives scattered and fled. They wailed and screamed as the dogs chased them through the bush, and the Spanish yelled back and mocked the natives with screams of their own. 2 Timucuans remained on the ground with their faces pointed to the sky. The Spanish approached and tortured them. They demanded to tell them where their base was and where the rest were hiding. The guides did their best to translate, saying that they did not understand the question, and as a result, the Spanish sliced off one native's head. The other native pleaded for his life and finally complied. The Spanish marched for another mile and saw a small housing complex north of the bank. They saw smoke rise above the morning mist and approached the town in haste, and Soto gave his command. Kill everything that moves. So they did. The Spanish slashed away. The women and the children fled north, screaming and wailing as the Spanish continued to chase them. In an hour, they killed 30 Timucua. They gathered up the corpses and tossed them into a pile. Most of the Indians were naked as the day they were born. And for those who remained, the Spanish took them as slaves and drove them back like cattle. Afterward, Soto entered the town and looked at the dead Indians on the ground. He looked again to the treetops and the tiny village. Then finally, he looked down at the river. At that time, Juan Anasco came to his side. Soto glared for half a minute until Anasco came within 5 feet of him. Then Anasco bowed and saluted. Don Hernando, the men caught some more a mile down. We killed most of them. Good, said Soto. Very good. Then he dismissed Juan Anasco back to the village, and Soto continued to stagger alone. And he laughed, quietly to himself. La Ferida went on, and the Spanish again marched through the swamp and slogged through the rain and muck. They slashed and cut and forged a path. For the next 4 days, the bright sun blistered, and of course, the next day it rained. Their horses slid in sloping valleys and struggled forward through the mud. Through the interior, they found more swamps and small sand islands. As they came across a basin, a swarm of mosquitoes hovered over their heads and bit at their faces. And as they neared the sands of the banks, they saw hundreds of crocodiles swimming in low water. 2 pigs were led down by the dogs and prepared for slaughter. In the pouring rain, the butchers laid out the pigs on tree stumps and made their cuts. It took a whole hour before the men got the fire going, but somehow they managed to make a medium fire, and they roasted the pig on racks of twine and bamboo. The men watched and waited. It wasn't ready until evening, so the men went back to their own platoons, performed their duties, and waited for sunset. Another day passed. The army marched another 3 miles, but none reported seeing any Indian of any kind. Moscoso and Balthazar looked back at their men. Then they looked back at the cannon crew. Their task was to push a gigantic cannon through the mud. Hour after hour, they failed. More men assisted, but no progress was made. The men then attached 5 horses and 2 mules to a chain, and along with the strength of 10 men, they finally budged the cannon above the mud. Yet, after this endeavor, the men looked half dead. As they got close to the basin, an accidental round was fired. The shot rang up to the sky and incinerated a giant oak. The men stood frozen and screamed. All prepared and gripped their swords and looked up to the trees, expecting an ambush. But then the men reported the false fire. Canales winced and spat as he passed the cannon crew. And with a blatant stare, he growled and made his point. Damn cannons! Lucky no one lost a foot yet. The next day, the stretch of swamp finally ended. They found a valley that led to a deep river. Then Soto ordered the army to rest there for 2 days, and as per usual, Soto remained alone in his tent, and the captains gathered and looked at their maps. but none had any understanding of just where the hell they were. The captains ordered their men at ease. Most of the men rested and slept the entire day, and the younger men were ordered into the trees to bring more wood for the fires. Hector and Vicente spent the entire morning and afternoon chopping down small trees with axes. They worked fast and carried load after load back to the wagon. And when the wagon returned, they refilled it with fresh wood and repeated. They hacked, chopped, and whistled songs and talked quietly to each other. But as noonday came, and as the humidity intensified, Hector began to tire. He staggered, and his head bobbed and dipped. Sweat poured out from his entire face, and the sun continued to climb. His body convulsed, yet there was much more work to do, so he pressed on and dug his axe through the trees. At moments, visions came to him. The visions were of the first slaughter of the Indians, which was mere weeks ago. He could still see all the blood and the sliced-off limbs and heads. And in his mind he heard the cries of the children, and as he tried to get his axe unstuck, he pulled hard and cut himself along his hands, and the blood dripped and gushed out. Vicente stared at him, but he did not say a word. A slight drizzle quickly formed into a downpour. The wagon came again, and Hector and Vicente quickly loaded the carriage. But soon, Hector fell to his knees, clutched his stomach, and vomited all over the wood. The men left him alone, and the rain poured down again. Vicente loaded the rest of the wood back into the carriage, and half an hour had passed. The rain stopped, but Hector remained on the ground. He breathed in deeper and looked as if he were drowning. And finally, Vicente held out his hand and got him up to his feet. But again, he said not a word to Hector. He just gave him the same disappointing look he gave him before, and they went back to camp. Hector slept for hours and was awoken by laughter. He noticed that he was back with his platoon, and he got up and meandered to see if there was any food left. He found a piece of rancid meat and swallowed it whole. Then he walked to a large fire and found Vicente huddled over the other men. At the helm of the fire, Hector found Canales, and he sat down with the rest of the men. For a long while, the men talked, but deep down, they all wanted to hear Canales' story of Peru, Catemaca, Cusco, the Pizarros, and their 14,000 pounds of gold. The men drank bottle after bottle of wine, and when Canales thought it was time, he held his men at attention and told him his tale of Peru. He was in a marvelous state. He was in rare and defined form. He was terrifically drunk, yet all too aware. But still, there was tremendous pride in his face, as if he were young again. He told the tale and slurred his words, and often he gave out a cry and a tear, and the men hung to his every word. If I have to be a son of a bitch, I'd settle to be a lucky son of a bitch. It's luck that got us here, and that luck has been with me as long as I can remember. And Canales went on. We followed the Pizarros. We heard story after story. Stories of Cortez. Stories of gold. None of us believed it. But we were dumb. So we went on. We went on for months. Through jungle and marsh. And heat and stink. It was hell. It was unbelievable hell. Then came the day. He found that small city. They called it Catemaca. It was made of stones and wooden walls. The slaves said there was much gold there. But when we got there, it was all empty. And Canales went on. The Pizarros commanded us to stay in formation, and we waited in the square. We were told to wait for the king, Atahualpa. We waited 2 straight fucking days. Then he made his way down. He didn't look real at first, and his slaves carried him on a golden chair. And in minutes, we were surrounded, but we were told not to make a single movement. But Pizarro knew what he was doing, and he asked the questions that needed to be asked. He asked about the gold, but Atahualpa refused. Then Canales laughed and took a drink. And when Atahualpa refused again, we struck. We charged. We gorged. There was so much blood. So much fucking blood. We killed everything that moved. It was beautiful. But Pizarro wanted him alive. And we kept his promise. We kept Atahualpa alive. Then we threatened him more. And when he gave up, he showed us all the gold. We collected 14,000 pounds of gold. 14,000 pounds. All the gold of all the world. And it was all ours. And when Canales finally finished telling his tale, he laughed, and his men kept still in silent wonder. Fires burnt from platoon to platoon, and more nights followed. There were no skirmishes for a week. During that time, there were rumors of a land in the distance named Apalache. It was said to be a set of mountains of gold and silver. Yet Soto commanded his men not to talk about these things until they had found them. And when he surmised his men had enough rest, he commanded them onward, and the march continued. A day later, Balthasar's men came across a stone path that ducked south and bent towards the river. But as another day passed, word spread of a horrible rumor. Alvas and Rangel lightly recorded in their journals, yet all knew the inevitable had happened. The army was running out of food. At noon of one day, Soto's captains held an emergency meeting. Anasco, Moscoso, Balthasar, and the others mounted upon a hill and waited for Soto to join them. When Soto arrived, he was quite agitated. His eyes were strained, and he moved from side to side. The captains sulked and stood at attention, and Soto listened to their concerns and grievances. They spoke of their rations and blamed the guides for their wrong coordinates, and when they finished, Soto barked at them in disgust. I know these facts. I know our situation. Do you think I'm dense? The captains shook their heads, but Soto continued to scream. You needn't tell me these things. You're simply wasting time. We should be marching. Forward! We've had our rest. And with that, the captains were all dismissed and reported back to their men. The heat returned, and Soto rode forth with his secretary Rangel to his side. They looked over the land. All seemed the same. Streams that fell to large rivers, basins, banks, and tiny pebbles that flooded over stretches of sand. Then Rangel gave Soto a map, and as Soto studied it, he grimaced and threw the map back at Rangel. Where in hell are those damn translators I asked for? We're as good as dead without the right interpreter. That's why we're in this hell. They haven't returned, sir, said Rangel. They were supposed to arrive today. Where are they? Last I heard, they were with Anasco's unit. Then get off your ass and go there. If I call for savages, I want truthful ones. You hear? The truth is all that matters. If they tell us the truth, they live. A shot rang out. Don Hernando! Don Hernando! What is it, Luis? I've been informed there's a village up ahead. Thank God, said Soto. Send 10 men and scout out the perimeter. Take the cavalry up the stream. Head them off. But sir, shouldn't we? Now, Moscoso. Do it. And as ordered, the cavalry headed up to the village. But again, there were no natives in sight. They found a temple and several huts. Then they found spears and baskets filled with maize. And later, they found a wooden statue of a 5-foot bird with gilded eyes. And as the men searched further, they found a path and a stretch of caves. The caves were diminutive and gray and were covered in thick green moss. Balthazar's men had found them first. They made their way inside each cave with dimly lit torches. When the men came out, they were covered with dust and cobwebs. But each man came back with something. By noon, the Spanish found more caves, and later they found a buried sack of Spanish coin that was some 30 years old. Moscoso's unit found rusted armor, lances, and swords. And towards sundown, Anasco's unit found horse hides and wool blanket quilted loins. All was set into a great pile. In the firelight, Soto sat next to all the priests and examined what they had found. Trinkets, swords, rusted helmets, ratted clothes, flags, strips of leather, and skulls and skeletons of men unknown. But one thing in particular that Soto examined closely was a leather-bound book. During the afternoon and well into the night, the priest uncovered and deciphered what they could read from the book, and they spoke with Soto directly. Brother Rodrigo, a fat, clean-shaven monk, was the first to examine the book. He wiped off the dirt and dust and studied the ratty, moldy pages. And as he read, his face lit up, and consequently, so did Soto's. What's the last date that was written, brother? Asked Soto. It reads, April 1527. 11 years ago. Is there any mention of Alvar Nunez? Cabeza de Vaca? No. But this was written by one of Narvaez's men, a treasurer of some kind. Read on, brother. It says that the men were so starved that they ate their horses, and that the Indians kept attacking. It also says that they found some refuge in these caves. And as the monk went on, Soto soon surmised the whole scene in his mind, and calculated both the history and the clear and present danger. His captains gathered and remained silent. We are not to move away from this place for at least a day. The savages are close enough. Let them come to us. Take the maize. The captains all nodded, and as night fell, the army made camp and patrolled the outside perimeter of the caves. Soto sat by the fire and listened to the wind. Then he awoke one of the monks and placed the book back into his hands. Do it again, brother. Read from the beginning. And the monk did. Soto stared at the flame and closed his eyes. And as the monk went on, he drifted into slumber and went deep into the recesses of his memory. And, like the schemes of a play, he placed all the pieces in accordance and tried to make sense. He imagined what Nunez would have done 13 years ago. He was a man who survived, but was completely damaged. And what was left of him was his memory of all that was seen and unseen. Still, they remained incomplete. There was a move or a missing piece. What it was, Soto did not know. So he dreamt more and dove further into the void. And when he woke up in the dark, he screamed and shouted. Yet no one heard his cries. The next day came. The scouts spent the first 2 hours rummaging through piles of dried beans they found hidden in the huts. The fog lifted, and a steady stream of rain poured onto the men. Some of the men went back into the caves, but they found nothing new. When the rain stopped, Soto ordered those scouts to forge ahead to find traces of food. The rest of the army remained at the camp and ate the beans and maize. The other men held patrol and paced a half a mile in the other direction. Then an arrow fired. It sliced through a man's hand. The man screamed, and the Spanish retaliated. They shot their hand cannons and fired round after round. The Indians yelled and screamed and shot more arrows, and the Spanish fired back with their heavy cannons. The men continued to shoot. Shells exploded through the trees, and smoke filled the canopy. Then the Indians fell to the ground, and the cavalry gave them chase. They tackled 3 Indians and lanced them through their backs. More Indians got away and dashed forth, escaping through the swamp. The smoke cleared. A quarter of an hour passed. Silence lingered. Then a faint sound faded in and out, and in the clear, they saw a man dash forth through the swamp. He tripped on a stump and crawled through the mud. Then the man yelled out as the dogs piled on top of him. "I am Castilian! I am Castilian!" More men gathered. They pulled the dogs away. The Spanish stood stunned. The man looked ravaged and old. His body was filled with bruises and tattoos. His eyes fluttered rapidly. One eye was completely shut. The other eye was open, but clearly damaged. The man shivered as if he had been caught beneath a sheet of ice. Balthazar and the translators came to the scene and was shocked that the man spoke Spanish. "Explain yourself," said Balthazar. The man responded. The words came sharp and clear. "I am Castilian. My name is Juan Ortiz. I'm from the Entrada de Navaez. Please, you must believe me. I am Castilian." Then Balthazar ordered his men, and they carried the man all the way back to the rendezvous point. The crowd gathered and shouted, "How can this be? He says he's one of Navaez's men. He's blind. He's an imposter. What use is he? He knows the land." Then Soto arrived. The men took Ortiz, ushered him into the tent, and departed. The priest and translators were summoned, but as Ortiz spoke in Spanish, Soto immediately smiled and dismissed them. And for an hour, Soto and Ortiz were left alone. They sat and ate cobs of corn at a time. And Ortiz told his tale. "Take your time, Ortiz," said Soto. "Tell me all you remember." "They tell me you are a slave." "I was captured. They tortured me." "They? Who are they?" The Timequa. The tribe. For how long? I don't know. It was autumn when we landed. It was spring when we... That was 11 years ago, Ortiz. 11 years? 11 years. But now you're free. We came just in time. It is you that I should be thanking. Soto studied Ortiz's eyes. The right side was fine, but the left side was filled with scars and seemed to have no pupil. What happened to your eye, Ortiz? I lost it. Trying to escape. They tortured me. Who did this to you? The Timequa. Who are they? They're the tribe of this land. Some are friendly, but most are cruel. But they were your captors? Yes. And do you know their language? Yes, most words. That's all I need to know. As the night passed, they talked about Spain and Navaez. They talked about the expedition and of the rumors of gold in Osita. Then they talked about the land and how far it stretched. But even so, it came all too clear. Ortiz was the miracle incarnate. He was the man who could save the whole Entrada, for he knew the land and the language. We're blessed. We're truly blessed, Juan, said Soto. You are a gift from God. From now on, I will put you in full command of the guides. I am honored, sir. They shared a chalice of wine, and before leaving the tent, Soto asked his final questions. This mountain, Apalache, what do you know of it? It goes on forever. I haven't gone too far. These Timequa, do you know their leader? Yes. Is he close? Yes. He's a cruel bastard. He has an army. So do we, Juan, said Soto. What is the nearest town? Osita. Yes, it's a very rich town. They have no silver, no gold. They have plenty food, though. I will show you. In time, you will show us everything, Ortiz. So Ortiz showed the way. Soto divided his platoons. They disengaged and paced for several more miles, and the land was just as Ortiz said it was, a land filled with swamps. Then Ortiz pointed. About 5 miles east of here is the swamp of Cal, he said. There are many streams there, many fish. They went into the water and caught bass and eels with their bare hands. They ate on the banks of the streams. However, they were on constant guard. They held tight to their swords, expecting snakes to drop from trees and crocodiles to jump from the waters. But most importantly, they peered into the dark, expecting the natives to ambush. But there was only rain. For 2 more days, the rain poured and everything was wet and dank. It took another 4 days for Rangel and Alvas to record their words. And as they waited for the sun to return, they took in what they saw and tried their best to remember. It is with my apologies to His Majesty for not writing sooner. However, due to ceaseless rain, precious ink does not suit or write well in the aforementioned conditions. In about the last days of June, the governor, Don Hernando de Soto, commanded the army to pass a swift current, and we followed the footbridges and crossed many streams of La Florida. During that time, we found a Christian named Ortiz, who was one of Narvaez's men, and who had survived all this time. After finding this Ortiz, the governor trusted him in guiding the entrada, and thus we followed him indefinitely. 5 days later, we reached a great swamp, which Ortiz had named the Swamp of Kale, in which we found an empty village. The governor ordered to take all the ripe maize, which was enough for 3 months. From there, we ate maize and cooked down the stalks and brewed soups and stews. In the weeks that follow, the army endured many skirmishes. The Indians killed 3 Christians, and those slaves that were captured informed Ortiz and the governor that there was a large province within a 7 days' walk from Apalachee. It is said to have an abundance of maize and other riches, and it is our hope we shall find such a place very soon. Humbly signed to the Royal Court of Spain, Gentleman of Alvas, 17th July, 1539. 7 more days passed. As the Spanish rode forth, they came up listless and distressed. They determined that the Indians who guided Ortiz to Apalachee had lied to them. There was no maize, no view of mountains, nor splendor, nor any promise. There were only stretches of streams and swamp. And, being that indeed true, Soto ordered the 2 responsible Indians to be tortured and hung. Ortiz talked to Soto for another hour, but for the remainder of the day, he remained alone and was asked not to be bothered. He remained at the edge of the camp with his guards on watch, and as night fell, he could be spotted playing a game of chess alone. His captains gathered, and Moscoso, Balthazar, and Anasco stood, stared, and pondered. He's still playing that game. I wonder why no one challenges him. They're afraid. It's a good enough reason. Why does he want to be alone all the time? Then Moscoso looked and turned. Let him be alone. Let the man think. He's planning. Planning what? His next move, said Moscoso. He knows how to fight these savages. We're in good hands. Put your faith in God. Let Don Hernando figure out the rest. And as they stared, Soto still remained alone by a dim fire. Night settled to a deep blue dawn, and the board was still filled to capacity. His eyes switched back from the pieces to the flame. But as he stared deeper, his eyes began to close. His nostrils flared, and he took in long and deep and painful breaths. And as he opened his eyes again, he buried himself deep within the board. And he tried to find a way. The fire grew and swung from side to side. He looked terrible. His eyes were sullen, and his skin was pale. He sighed, stared up to the night stars, and snorted. What month is this? I asked. They say it's October, said Soto. I don't really believe them, though. Then he took the 2 pawns, held them beneath his back, and presented 2 fists before the flame. Choose, Sardina. I pointed to his left hand. He unveiled the pawn, and it came up black. He neither smiled nor said a word. He set up the board. But I noticed something wasn't right. Soto hadn't all his pieces. One of his squares was empty. It was his most important piece. "Where's your queen?" I asked. "I don't need her," Soto said. "Did you lose her?" "No." "Then why?" "I've learned to play without her," said Soto. "This game will be no exception." So the board was set. 31 pieces. 15 white, 16 black. I stared at Soto's empty square. Then I held my queen and placed her firmly on her square. "I never really understood this piece," I said. "No one does, Sardina." He made his first move. And just like almost every game, he moved his king's pawn 2 squares up to the center. From that moment on, I knew for certain that this would be the last game I would ever play. I felt a pain in my stomach, and I cradled my head. But Soto only stared. "You know the point of the game, don't you?" "To capture the enemy king," I said. "Good," said Soto. "At least you remember that. Make your move." The Spanish pressed forward. Beyond the swamp of kale was a flat and peculiar land. It was a beginning stretch of hills that the natives called Appalachia. 3 days they marched without incident. They came upon many paths of creeks and low-level barriers. To the delight of the Spanish, it did not rain for an entire week. It had only been 2 months since they made landfall, yet the morale of the men remained content. Then one day, they came across a land that the natives called Tano. Ortiz took them to a nearby housing complex just south of a small creek, but it was there that their respite of peace had ended, and days of confusion and panic soon followed. They heard the Indians gather from the edge of the banks, but they did not see them. The cavalry flanked the near side platoons, yet the Indians sought and diverted their attack to the opposite directions. The cannons fired many rounds, but the Indians went unharmed and attacked from the tops of the trees. They launched spears which killed 2 horses, and in the fog of the cannon fire, the Indians escaped and disappeared. As Soto surveyed the situation, he looked up to the trees. But his captains clearly weren't as calm. They rode up to him with frightened and paralyzed eyes. "Don Hernando, they've killed 2 of our men, Javier and Miguel. These savages are hiding in the trees. What shall we do?" Soto looked up again. Then he finally spoke. "Bastards want to fight in the trees? Let them die in the trees. Take the cannons. Fire at the canopies. Fire at will. And don't stop until I say so." So the Spanish fired. The blast continued for several minutes, but then all went quiet. And as the Spanish waited for the ambush, the Indians jumped out and caught their rear flank, and the Indians tore and banged off their Spanish armor, and the Spanish sliced away. The skirmishes did not cease. The next day, the same exact event had happened, and the next day still. The skirmishes came in waves, no matter night or day. They lasted for mere minutes to whole hours, and they were fought from one end of the village to the other. Even in the pouring rain, the Indians fought. Some jumped to their deaths. Others hid deep within the trees, throwing axes and launching arrows. On one day, the Spanish lost 3 men. All had been knifed along the throat. One Spaniard was found with an arrow lodged square in his neck, and within a week, 7 Spaniards had been killed. But as time wore on, the Spanish gained their pound of flesh. They hacked countless Indians limb by limb, and they took great joy in doing so. Their dogs gave chase and tore through the tribesmen, and their slobbering mouths dripped in pools of blood. Yet the more the Spanish retaliated, the more the Indians remained obstinate. The Indians kept fighting. The Spanish retaliated. And it seemed that the ambushes and counterattacks would go on forever. Not far from the cavalry, Canales' unit dropped off fresh supplies to the cannon crew. They were then ordered to patrol the perimeter of a stretch of low trees. Vicente and Hector talked to each other, but only sparingly. Their exhaustion proved to be too much, and they drifted in and out of sleep. In the dank heat of the night, their bodies seemed to be perpetually collapsing, ounce by ounce. Vicente slept, but Hector seemed to be in a different sleep, one so deep that he couldn't tell whether he was awake or dreaming. And because of this, he walked through the night with his eyes open. But he could not feel his body. He heard voices and followed them. Then he spotted a native child up top of the canopy. The child swayed on a low branch and drank out of a skull. The child looked at him, but he wasn't fazed, and the liquid that poured out of his mouth was red blood. And the child slurped it and showed his rotten teeth. Then Hector blinked and awoke to clear consciousness. But the child disappeared. On the day the Entrada left the swamp of kale, the Spanish marched through fog and forged a path through a long mile of wood. They made progress and spent 3 days marching north. From there, the skirmishes seemed to subside. But Soto, as well as his captains, knew this reprieve would not last very long. Soto surveyed the land ahead. It was comprised of dense, thick trees and heavy, tall, and slumping grass. Then he examined the river south with his mind in heavy calculation, and Moscoso came to his side. "We need leverage," Soto said. "Leverage?" said Moscoso. "We have nothing to offer them." "Forgive me, Governor, but why should we offer them anything? They've killed enough of our men already." "Get me Ortiz," said Soto. 5 minutes later, Ortiz arrived, and Soto asked his questions. "Ortiz, what is this land ahead?" "They call it Napituca, sir." "What do you know of it?" "I know there are many Indians among it. Narvaez tried to kill every one of them. They ended up killing us." "Ortiz, I need to speak with the chief of these people. There must be a chief, correct?" "There is," said Ortiz. "I don't know if it's the same one as before, but I know there is a chief." "I will ask." "Ask away," said Soto. "Moscoso." "Yes, Don Hernando." "Spread the word. Take prisoners. Lock them in chains." Dusk came, and the next day Ortiz guided the army north across a stream, and beyond it, as promised, was the town of Napituca. The Spanish marveled at the sight, for unlike the towns they crossed, Napituca was densely populated, and among the largest cities they had found. and all of it was contained by large stone fences that narrowed to an arching bluff. There were many huts along the banks, but there seemed to be even larger huts some 200 feet across the bluff. Some houses were 60 feet high, and their residents, some 1,000 Napituca Indians, were waiting for the Spanish to arrive. A scout team sent an initial peace offering to the subordinates of the head chief, but as the Spanish entered the town of Napituca, they were greeted with arrows. They fought the entire afternoon and well into dusk, but Soto's men maintained his command. They captured 100 prisoners, locked them in gangs of chains, and forced them to march behind the Cuban slaves. Then the translators asked the slaves for gold and treasure, but the slaves simply did not answer. More slaves were gathered by Anasco's unit cavalry, and at the end of the day, the Spanish captured a total of 300 Indians. As Ortiz spoke with the head dignitaries that were captured, he soon learned that the head chief of Napituca, the Caque as they called him, was near and would meet the Spanish in the morning. The Spanish refused to give their prisoners food or water, and the prisoners wailed and moaned in the dark. Some collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Others extended their hands and prayed loudly, flooding the air with their songs. But the Spanish, being furious and agitated by their cries, slashed the slaves across their face with whips and knifed them in their stomachs to see how much they could bleed. By midnight, the captains finally understood Soto's scheme. Soto addressed them by a fire. He explained that possessing the prisoners was their leverage. Then he explained that if the chief was held prisoner, then it would be their ultimate leverage, and all awards would follow. And the next day, the army seized the entire land of Napituca, including the chief's favorite son. Upon learning this, Soto rode about a quarter of a mile to a fire pit located between the banks and approaching bluff. Ortiz stayed by Soto's side and informed him that the chief of Napituca was a mere hour away. Soto ordered his men to stand their ground, and they waited the entire morning. Noon approached, and a cry echoed out. Again, Soto commanded each of his captains to restrain their men from any activity, and both sides remained tense and still. Then 1,000 Indians gathered and surrounded the Spanish from every side. The translators offered peace meals, beads, and wreaths, but the Indians had no interest. Finally, the Caque approached Soto. He was accompanied by 24 guards, and he stood naked with tattoos covering his face, neck, and shoulders. The translators moved in closer. Ortiz translated the formalities, but the Caque gave no orders. He just stared at Soto, who remained on his horse. More and more Indians were spotted along the woods, and Soto peered from one end of the bank to the other. Ortiz. Yes, sir. Are these all the tribe of Napituca? Most of them, sir. Some are Timucua. Then the Napituca translators approached the Spanish priest, and Soto nodded to Ortiz. Do your best, Juan. The villagers and tribesmen looked at the Spanish. They were bitter faces all around. Then Soto closed his eyes and whispered to himself. Same story, over and over. The Caque replied. He went on for several minutes, but not a word was translated. And when Soto finally had enough, he moved his horse closer to the center and shouted as loud as he could. People of Napituca! I have told you several times, our people wish to come in peace. We expect you to do the same. The translation followed, but the Napituka stood confused, and the more Soto went on, the less and less they seemed to understand. But Soto persisted. If you do not comply, may God help you. We come from Holy Spain. Go ahead, Juan. Then Soto pointed to all the prisoners the Spanish had captured the night before. We have hundreds of your people. They will be our slaves forever if you do not comply. In exchange, all we ask is... Soto reached into his cloak and retrieved a gold necklace. It was Atahualpa's necklace from 12 years ago, and the Indian stared. Ask them, Juan. Ask them where we can find it. Ortiz asked, and the translators asked again. But the Caque and his people remained stupefied with anger. Then Soto continued. Please, show us this, and we will let your people go. The tribe stood appalled with their eyes open, forever locked in a state of confusion. And Soto went on. We have come from a world away. If there is gold, silver, or any precious metal, please show us. It is imperative that we possess these things. Show us, and you will not be harmed. Show us, and your people will all be saved. A long silence followed. Ortiz pleaded to the tribe, but the tribe pleaded back. They say that they do not understand, said Ortiz. Then Soto sighed. He uttered words that were only recognizable to himself. Then he sighed again and spat. He signaled to his men, and a minute later a soldier walked forward, carrying a wooden box. And again, Ortiz relayed back to Soto. They say they don't understand. They have no gold. They say they have no idea what you're talking about, Don Hernando. The soldier handed the box to Soto. Soto then handed the box to Ortiz. Then Soto spoke again. If that is the case, I must show them gratitude. Show them, Ortiz. See if they don't understand. And as Ortiz came walking with the box in hand, he stopped and held it above his shoulder so all could see. Then he set the box down and opened the lid. Inside was the head of the Caque's son. Ortiz clutched it by the hair, and the tribe shrieked in disgust and fear. Soto marveled at the sight. He smiled and seethed from his teeth and stared right into the Caque's eyes. But oddly, the Caque gave no emotion. And Soto spat to the ground, then turned to Ortiz. Do they understand now? And to the shock of all the Spanish, the Caque turned his back, and his people followed. In all the screaming and shouting, another translation came out from the ranks, and a priest forwarded it to Ortiz. They say they will see you in the morning. And with that, the tribe departed, making no other sounds besides their footsteps. The Spanish watched the thousands of Napituka Indians head back from whence they came, and they stood dumbfounded. Soto raced back and forth on his horse, seemingly and perpetually lost in thought. He looked at the giant lake south before the bluff. Then he looked back east to the trees. Then he looked to the sky and realized there was little time. The captains panicked and rode from unit to unit, demanding to hear an order. But none were given. There was little light left in Napituka, so the army rested in angst. The men asked their captains ceaselessly, wondering, fearing, doubting what would happen next. But each time, their captains gave the same response and urged them to keep steady. They smelled smoke from a great fire that was far in the distance. And at nightfall, Soto ordered his captains by a fire. "It is a ruse. It is a goddamn ruse," said Soto. "Lucky for us, they gave themselves away." The captain stood confused. None replied, and Soto bit his lips and continued. "They will attack in about an hour. They want us to wait until morning. But if we do, we're dead. So we'll counteract that now. Moscoso, Anasco, drive the cavalry north between the bluff. That's their main entry point." They saluted and departed. Soto switched and commanded the rest. "Balthazar, Diego, assemble the artillery south and east. Fire directly into the trees. Give them no warning shots. We cannot afford it. For the rest, follow my lead." The army followed, and the captains readied their men on a slight hill just before the lake. A dozen of the heavy cannons positioned themselves triangularly and loaded their rounds. Then, as Soto expected, a cry shouted out from yonder. The cry grew in volume and intensity. It rumbled to a fever-pitch crescendo, and it echoed and clamored on for a long, painful minute. It was the cry of the 1,000 Napituca. Scores of Timicor warriors, lancers, bowmen, and spearmen rushed up the hill and screamed. But the well-positioned Spanish cavalry countered. They charged and attacked the tribe, trampling them with their horses. Then Soto sighed, and the cannons fired into the interior, and the plumes of black smoke filled the sky. And, as expected, the whole of Napituca erupted in chaos. Even though the Spanish were severely outnumbered, Soto's plan worked in perfection. In less than 10 minutes, 100 Napituca warriors lay dead on the ground. In 5 minutes, 100 more were slain. Several more were incinerated by the cannon shells. Body after body stacked the sandhill, and gorges of blood emerged and covered the ground in spews of red and black. The cannons reloaded. They fired and repeated, and Soto watched calmly, switching his eyes from side to side. Out from behind the lake, more warriors rushed the land. They held spears and clubs, but the Spanish were ready for them. The muskets fired a second round. The warriors pressed through and brought some of the Spanish down, but the rounds and rounds of gunfire proved too much, and the warriors retreated back to the lake, screaming and shrieking. In a matter of minutes, the cavalry slaughtered all that came before them. Streams of blood fell like confetti. Soto ordered the infantry to move towards the lake. The Indians held their ground for quite some time, shooting arrows from close range and preventing the Spanish from gaining ground. But time was not on their side, and when they ran out of arrows, the Timacuans charged back. They leaped from great heights and landed on the Spanish backs. Slews of spears flooded the sky, but each time the warriors advanced a charge, they were met with cannon fire. In close combat, the warriors injured many Spanish, but they killed very few. And the fighting went on for another hour, then another. Blood seeped into the mud. Blood seeped into the lake, and it smeared down the whole land, drip by drip. Canales followed Onasco's men, and they, along with their compadres, slashed away at the natives. Soon the light artillery and crossbowmen joined, and the Spanish fired at close range. The infantry followed their progression as the spears fired through the air. The Spanish knocked them off with shields and pressed on, and charge after charge broke down and failed, and more bodies fell to the mud. And from there, the battle became a slaughter. And the Spanish kept coming, lighting their torches and setting the village huts on fire. And the land was submerged in billows of smoke and swirling ash. The cavalry rode forth and destroyed the outside flank, but by then the warriors knew their fate. They had two options: to fight on or retreat into the lake. Half of them fought, the others retreated. Those who fought in the dark swung blindly, sometimes spearing their own tribesmen. And when the last of the warriors fell, the Spanish surrounded the lake and took their torches to light the water. And there they saw the remaining Timacuas swim for their lives. They heard them splash and scream and cry, for the water was deep and cold. The cannons came forth and struck their shells clear into the water, and smoke and steam once again flashed and gleamed about the water. But as they ceased, the cries of the Timacua took over. And as night descended, the only light that remained was from the Spanish torches. Soto came to the scene about an hour later with Moscoso and about 5 translators. "Tell them to surrender," said Soto. "We've tried," said Moscoso, "but they've refused each time." "Very well," said Soto. "We'll just watch them die then." And that's exactly what they did. One by one, the Spanish watched the 100 warriors in the lake drop down to the surface and drown. All throughout the night, the Spanish waited and counted down. 100, 70, 55, 21. The remaining warriors swam in defiance, pumping their legs to desperately stay afloat. But after another hour, there were only 12 warriors left in the lake. Their faces looked dead, pale, and gray. They trembled and shivered. They huddled together and saw their breath draw out in the cold, and they screamed and cried. Then the water became very still. They prayed in heavy repetitions, and as ordered, the Spanish merely waited. Some laughed, others marveled, and within another hour, half of the warriors dropped to the bottom. And 15 minutes later, 5 more did the same. At last, only one warrior remained. He was the youngest of all. He swam in circles and made the Spanish wait longer than they wanted to. But his strength was clearly waning. The gaps of air surfaced and formed a cloud of fog above his head. He turned from side to side, but at every turn was an awaiting Spanish soldier holding a crossbow. He swam again and went deeper into the lake, and as he looked back, he saw all the Spanish torches. From his view, they looked like tiny candles. He kept afloat and swam for another quarter of an hour. The Spanish shouted at him, and the slaves begged him to surrender. His eyes remained open, but then his face turned blue. His legs locked from underneath. His arms jerked. And in his last painful minute, his body gave out, and he sunk to the bottom. In the morning, what remained of the Napituca were crackling dying fires, the stench of burning flesh, and massive pits filled with bodies. And so the Spanish walked, seemingly in a trance. Hector was no exception. He felt the horror inside, but he could not define it. He walked from end to end with a madness slowly creeping inside his soul, and each step he felt buried in burden with tremendous, everlasting guilt and pain. He walked towards the monks and priests, but they were not in prayer. No psalms were sung, no blessings were offered. They merely lowered their heads. He thought about all the warriors he had killed, and he smelled his bloody hands. Likewise, Vicente too walked in a trance, but he seemed not to be fazed at all. Instead, he seemed carefree and accomplished. He smashed his swords against clay pots with his mouth hung open. He looked demented and deeply satisfied. Hector met Vicente along the swamp, and they stared into the lake. Then they heard an awful scream. They turned their backs, and a warrior charged right for them. Hector countered with his sword, and the warrior's momentum flipped him in the air. The warrior landed on his back, and Hector quickly approached and pointed the edge of his sword towards the warrior's throat. But then he stopped. "Come on, Hector, kill him!" Vicente yelled. But Hector did not move. He looked at the warrior's face, and soon again Hector's eyes fluttered. He was still in a trance. He stumbled and tried to open his eyes, and the warrior soon bolted back to his feet. "Hector!" The warrior reached for his spear, but in one swift motion, Vicente slashed the warrior's head and decapitated him. When he finished, Vicente placed the sword back in his cloak. Then he gave Hector a great look of disdain. The two went on and rested near an oak tree. Vicente grabbed a pig's foot out of his bag and ate it voraciously. He then offered a piece to Hector, but Hector refused. Then Vicente spat to the ground and looked at Hector straight in the eye. "What's the matter with you, Hector?" He gave no response. "Hector, what's the matter with you? What the hell were you doing? You had him beaten. Why didn't you kill him then?" "I hesitated." "You hesitated?" You're what?" "I'm tired," said Hector. "We came here to be kings, not priests," said Vicente. "They're not human. Put that through your head." An hour passed. Vicente trudged through sopping grass and spotted a small caiman swimming up to the surface. The beast waddled to and fro. Its scales were dull and green. Vicente waited and watched its every move. And when the moment was right, he reached for his sword and pierced the caiman straight through its forehead. The caiman hissed and whipped its body from side to side. But soon it stumbled, and Vicente laughed and approached closer. He took out another sword and bashed the caiman on its head until its whole mouth ran dark with blood. And Vicente screamed and smiled. Come on, you! Eat away! Eat away!" Hector looked on. He neither returned the smile nor showed any emotion at all. Later, a man came to the spot. It was Jimenez, a slightly older man who was part of their platoon. He looked at Hector and Vicente, and he sighed and turned his head. "There you are. We've been looking all over for you." "We didn't receive any orders," said Vicente. "What happened?" "I've got bad news," said Jimenez. "What happened?" Jimenez did not respond. "What the fuck happened?" Vicente repeated. They followed Jimenez back to camp. Then when they reached the sands, Jimenez pointed. It was a freshly cut leg, but it wasn't the natives. A huddle of men gathered. Their Captain Canales hobbled on one foot and screamed, "Let me walk! Let me fucking walk!" Vicente shook his head over and over in disbelief. Hector simply closed his eyes. "What happened?" "A cannonball tore right through him," said Jimenez. Canales stumbled and hobbled. He was wrapped in bloody rags, his face smeared with sweat and mud. Blood sipped through his wound and dripped to the ground. The further he hobbled, the more he hollered. And the men stood and stared at him, expecting him to fall at any minute. Then it happened. He stumbled and fell to the ground. He screamed and hollered until blood spewed from his mouth. The men lifted him and placed him on his back, but still the blood gushed. And Canales screamed until he could no longer. They buried him that night, and at noon of the next day, it rained. Slaves were whipped and transported from endless lines, and Soto continued to stare into the distance. 2 horses rode up, and the men saluted. Later, Moscoso and Balthasar approached Soto and gave him their reports. "What did you find?" said Soto. Both shook their heads. "What about Anasco's crew?" "The scouts north haven't found anything. The scouts east are due soon." "Did they find any gold?" They did not respond. "Did they find any gold?" Soto repeated. "No, Don Hernando, they did not. Don Hernando, shall I?" "No. Whatever you have in mind is not necessary." "But sir, it's not necessary. Where is this Caque?" "We captured him, Don Hernando." "Bring him to me. Immediately." The rain poured, and the men brought the imprisoned chief of Napetuca towards Soto. Ortiz and the translators made their way to the scene, and Soto staggered towards the Caque, holding a chained mace. "Tell him his people fought well, but we are his masters now, and we will be even crueler to them if he does not comply. They will see the other side of justice." The Caque moaned, shouting for his subordinates, but by then they were all enslaved and driven off behind the pigs and cattle. The Caque set his fiery eyes onto Soto, and they shared a long glare. Then he mumbled, and Ortiz retorted back. He says, I do not understand." Soto drew closer. He leaned and tilted his head. "Ask where he's hiding the gold." The translators asked. He says he does not know," said Ortiz. "Ask him again," said Soto. Ortiz asked again. The Caque shook his head. His face was filled with disgust and hatred. And Soto looked on, matching his countenance with seas and scowls of torrent breath. "He still says he doesn't know," said Ortiz. "Very well," said Soto. "We showed him enough mercy. Cut him limb by limb. Start with the feet. Unleash him." The order was given. The guards unleashed the chief, and Soto grabbed his sword. But the Caque had already broken away. He lunged and leaped and tackled Soto to the ground, and with one quick shot, he pummeled Soto across the face with a jagged stone. Then he yelled out to his people, urging them to revolt. But not a minute later, the Spanish surrounded, stabbed, and decapitated the Caque, and the slaves turned silent in utter shock. Immediately afterward, the men surrounded Soto. He lay on his back for nearly half an hour. He heard voices which he could not discern, and blood spewed from his forehead and dripped down to his chin. When he awoke, he saw the heads of all his captains. It took several more minutes, but he got back up to his own power. "Water! Bring him water!" shouted the captains. "Bring the governor water!" And when Soto was handed the cup, he slurped his own blood. He spat out and wiped his face with his muddied hand. And as the blood dripped down once more, Soto clutched his head and looked up to the gray, dark sky. Blood only runs like rivers, like rivers. He walked alone for several minutes. No man approached him. They all stared from a distance. Then something crossed his vision and caught his eyes. It was the freshly decapitated head of the Caque. It had been placed upon a stump, and Soto tilted his head and glared at it. And as he approached, Soto took out his mace and mauled the already decapitated head with deep, repetitive blows. When he finished, Soto hobbled and studied the wind. He heard many things. He heard the women scream. He heard footsteps and the hiss of maiden snakes. And again, he felt the blood drip from his nose. And he felt it drip down to his knees and ankles. But in some perverse way, Soto seemed to smile through the pain and continued to bleed. Then he opened his eyes, and his men heard him laugh in the rain.